Hi everyone and welcome. This is the session number 3 for the Security Operations Analyst course, DSC 200. So we have another 2 modules to cover today, following the progress from the previous day. Let me start by displaying for today the today's agenda. For day number 3, we are going to start with the module number 5, and we also have the module 6 for today. Module 5 is for configuring our Microsoft Sentinel environment. The lessons for that module that I will cover during the 2 hours are the introduction to Azure Sentinel, create and manage Sentinel workspaces, and query logs in Azure Sentinel. And also we have a lab, which is for configure our Sentinel environment. Then for module number 6, we have connect logs to Microsoft Sentinel with 2 lessons to cover during my presentation for the first 2 hours. Connect data to Azure Sentinel using data connectors, and connect Microsoft services to Azure Sentinel. Like with the previous days, you have homework. Within the homework, you can go for Microsoft Learn for and take a look at the modules in Microsoft Learn for the SC200. And you are going to cover for module 5, use watch list in Azure Sentinel and utilize threat intelligence in Azure Sentinel. Well, not Azure anymore, it's Microsoft Sentinel. And for module 6, connect logs to Microsoft Sentinel, you have the connect Microsoft 365 Defender to Sentinel, connect Windows host to Sentinel, common event format logs to Sentinel, syslog data sources to Sentinel, and connect threat indicators to Sentinel. And a lab exercise for module 6, connect logs to Microsoft Sentinel. So welcome everyone, buckle up and give me a second to start presenting the first module. Module file, configure our Microsoft Sentinel environment. Lesson 1, an introduction to Sentinel. The lessons, the topics that we'll cover in this lesson, identify the various components and functionality of Microsoft Sentinel, and identify use cases where Microsoft Sentinel will be a good solution. We can start by defining what is the Microsoft Sentinel resource and service, because we need to create it as resource. It is considered a security information and event management service. It's also a security orchestration and automated response, and also is considered an extended detection response, an XDR. Sentinel is built on another resource that is the log analytics workspace. From yesterday topics, we saw what's a log analytics workspace. Basically, it's a resource that is like a cloud storage solution specifically for logs. Log analytics workspace. And using the Microsoft Sentinel, we're using data connectors. With the data connectors is how we're just creating the pipelines or the persistent connection from services or resources inside and outside Azure, because the log workspace support to connect logs from Azure resources other cloud services or resources, and the on-premise also, like the logs for physical or virtual machines. So Sentinel is a cloud native SIEM, security and information and management system. And a system is a tool that an organization uses to collect, then to analyze, and then to perform security operations on its computer systems. Those systems can be hardware appliances, can be applications, or both. So in most simple form, a SIEM system enables us to collect and query logs, to do some form of correlation or anomaly detection, and we can use it to create alerts and incidents based on our findings. A SIEM system might offer functionality like log management with the ability to collect, to store, and query the log data from resources within our environment. We can use it for alerting. We can have a proactive look inside the log data for potential security incidents and anomalies. We can use it for visualization because we can generate graphs and dashboards that will provide visual insights into our log data. And we can use it for incident management also because we have the ability to create, to update, to assign, and to investigate incidents that have been identified. And we can use it for querying data. A rich KQL or query language similar to that for log management that we can use to query and understand the data, and also to respond because we can set alerts, alert conditions based on that. How the Microsoft Sentinel works, some of the components, the most important one in order to, because, well, we can create the Sentinel on top of a log workspace, but nothing will be recorded. There will be no logs and no special data or log ingestion that will happen or that will be created automatically. That's why the data connectors is one of the most important components on it. So the first thing to do is to have our data ingested into Sentinel. So data connectors will cover all scenarios and sources, including but not limited to syslogs, common event format, trusted automated change of indicator information or taxi connectors for threat intelligence, Azure connectors, third-party connectors from other environments like AWS services and so on. Once that we have data connected, another component is the log retention. So after it's being ingested into Sentinel, our data is stored by using log analytics. The benefits of using log analytics will include the ability to use the custom query language to query our data. Another component is the use of workbooks. We can use workbooks to visualize our data within Sentinel. We can think of a workbook as a dashboard. We can use built-in workbooks that we can create from templates, or we can create our own custom dashboard design. Each component in the dashboard is built by using an underlying KQL query of our data. We can use for analytics alerts to generate alerts, or we can have some proactive analytics across our data, so we are notified when something suspicious occurs. And we can enable the built-in analytics alerts within our Sentinel workspace. Also, we can use it for threat hunting. If the Security Operations Center analysts need to hunt for suspicious activity, there are some built-in hunting queries that they can use. The analysts can also create their own queries. Sentinel also integrates with Azure Notebooks. Notebooks provides example notebook for advanced hunters who want to use the full power of a programming language to hunt through their data. Usually this hunting It's a proactive one. Other component is the incidents and investigation. An incident is created when an alert that we have enabled is triggered. In Sentinel, we can do standard incident management tasks like changing status or assigning incidents to individuals for investigation. So Sentinel also has investigation functionality. So we can visually investigate incidents by mapping entities across log data along a timeline. And also we can use it for automation playbooks. So with the ability to respond to incidents automatically, we can automate some of our security operations, and we can make security operations center more productive. Because with Sentinel, we can integrate an Azure Logic app. An Azure Logic app is a kind of a web application that uses multiple connectors to create automated workflows with other type of Logic app connectors. So using this Logic app that will include more than one data Logic app connectors, we can respond to incidents automatically, like the possibility to send notifications or alerts, emails, and so on, setting up conditions, and then we'll integrate with other solutions or systems. And that will enable us to create automated workflows or playbooks in response to events, reacting on events. When should be a good idea to use Sentinel? We can use Sentinel if we want to collect event data from various sources, or if we need to perform security operations on that data to identify suspicious activity. Some security operations could include, for example, visualization of log data, or some anomaly detection, threat hunting, security incident investigation, or automated response to alerts and incidents. Sentinel offers other capabilities that could help us to decide whether it is the right fit for the organization. Some of its capabilities are the cloud-native security information and event management. So there are no servers to provision, and then automatic scaling. So scaling is effortless. No operating systems to control, no other resources. Just we can create in 2 minutes a Sentinel on top of a log workspace. And if we don't have a log and a workspace, we can create it in the same Sentinel deployment first and then create the Sentinel service. There is as another capability integration with the Azure Logic apps and multiple Logic app connectors to create automated workflows. A benefit of Microsoft Research and Machine Learning is another capability. There is support for hybrid cloud and on-premise environments. And it will provide us a SIEM and a data lake all in one. When we began investigating Sentinel, organization will have some clear requirements, like support for data from multiple cloud environments, and features and functionality required for a security operations center without too much administrative overhead. Next lesson is the steps to create and manage Microsoft Sentinel workspaces. The topics into this lesson, we're going to start describing Microsoft Sentinel workspace architecture. We are going to see how we can install Microsoft Sentinel workspace and how to manage a Microsoft Sentinel workspace. There are 3 implementation options for a Sentinel workspace. The first one is using a single tenant with a single Azure or a single Microsoft Sentinel workspace. The single tenant with a single Sentinel workspace will be the central repository for logs across all resources within the same tenant. And this workspace receives logs from resources in other regions within the same tenant. Remember that a tenant is equal to a directory in Azure AD. We can interchange this concept. Single tenant means that we have that Sentinel workspace using one directory created in Azure AD, basically. So this workspace will receive logs from resources in other regions within the same tenant. And because the log data, when it's collected, will travel across regions and store in another region, this creates two possible concerns. First, it can incur a bandwidth cost. And second, if there is a data governance requirement to keep data in a specific region, the single workspace option will not be an implementation option. The second possible implementation option is a single tenant with regional Azure Sentinel workspaces. The single tenant with regional Sentinel workspaces will have multiple Sentinel workspaces. And because the Sentinel workspaces are using log analytic workspaces, those multiple workspaces can be distributed across different regions. So requiring the creation and configuration of multiple Sentinel and log analytic workspaces. But at that point, if we have some specific regional requirements, then we can create as many log workspaces on as many regions that we need. And the possible implementation number 3 is the multi-tenant. If we are required to manage a Sentinel workspace, but not in our tenant or directory, we can implement the multi-tenant workspaces using a service called Azure Lighthouse. This security configuration grants us the access to the tenants. Then the tenant configuration within the tenant, regional or multi-regional, is the same consideration as before. So now, what is Azure Lighthouse for a multi-tenant approach? Azure Lighthouse enables multi-tenant management with scalability, with higher automation, and enhanced governance across resources. So with Azure Lighthouse, the customer can maintain control over who has access to their tenant, which resources they can access, and what actions can be taken. Enterprise organizations managing resources across multiple tenants can also use Azure Lighthouse to streamline some management tasks. For cross-tenant management experiences, lets you work more efficiently with Azure services like Azure Policy, like Microsoft Sentinel, Azure Arc, and many more. So users can see what changes were made and by whom in the activity log, which is stored in the customer tenant and can be viewed by users in the managing tenant. Lighthouse includes multiple ways to streamline engagement and management. With an Azure Delegated Resource Management, for example, you can manage your customer Azure resources securely from within your own tenant without having to switch contexts and control planes. So customer subscriptions and resource groups can be delegated to specify users and roles in the managing tenant with the ability to remove access as needed. Another way of the management with Azure Lighthouse is with the new Azure portal experiences, because we can view cross-tenant information in the My Customers page section in the Azure portal. Corresponding service providers page that let the customer view and manage their service provider access. Also, with Lighthouse, we can use Azure Resource Manager templates to onboard delegated customer resources, and we can perform cross-tenant management tasks. And we can use a managed service offers in Azure Marketplace. We can offer our services to customers through private or public offers and automatically onboard them to Azure Lighthouse. High-level steps to create a Microsoft Sentinel workspace. We need to start as a step number one, the Sentinel workspace. So after designing the workspace architecture, we can log into the Azure portal. And at the search bar, we can search for Sentinel and then select Azure Sentinel or Microsoft Sentinel, sorry. Microsoft Sentinel workspaces will show a list of the current workspaces. And you can click to select the Add button to start the creation process with the user interface. Step 2, then there is the Sentinel installation prerequisites. To enable Sentinel, we need contributor permissions at least to the subscription in which the Sentinel workspace resides. To use Sentinel, then we need either contributor or reader permissions on the resource group that the workspace belongs. And then step 3, we need to create and configure the log analytic workspace. So the next page, Sentinel to a workspace will display a list of available. Well, actually, it's the step 2, creating the workspace. First, we comply with the installation prerequisite, then we need the workspace, and then finally, we can select to add the Microsoft Sentinel to the workspace. We can select then the plus button to create a new workspace button to start the create log and a workspace process, and then the basic tab include different options. Let's take a look at the process with a quick demonstration. This is my portal here that I have an active subscription. I'm just going back to the home. And then I'm searching to the service Microsoft Sentinel. Now I have a previous one, or just call Sentinel 1, but we can create more than one in different regions, for example. Now here we can see, okay, you can add Microsoft Sentinel to a workspace. However, I don't have a workspace yet that is free to connect to the Sentinel. I have one workspace, but it's already linked to my Sentinel 1. So my option here is to create a new workspace first. Then I can open the assistant to create the log in a workspace. I can use an existing resource group that I have one for Sentinel. And then I will specify a name for this new workspace. And this is where we can select the region aligned with the organization requirements for data and log retention residency, for example, or log storage. Is US, let's say, it's okay. We can apply tags, but not just to the workspace, but to any type of Azure resource. We can apply up to 50 name and value pair tags. We can use tags to locate, search, and filter across hundreds of resources by using a combination of tags. Examples of applying a tag: a date of creation of this resource. I can specify today's date as the name and the value pair. I can specify a name of the owner or the person who created, a reason for that, an ID, whatever we can imagine as a tag, for example, up to 50 per resource, in this case, per log workspace, log entity workspace. And click on Next to review plus create, and a final validation that I'm not missing something, and then I can click finally in to create. The pricing tier is associated on a per gigabyte, depending on the amount of storage space that I'm using within this log collection. This is going to define how much am I going to pay on the amount of paying per gigabyte basically. Now, the process is now creating the workspace, but that's like the first resource that we need. Eventually, you can click here to refresh to see the available workspace, because remember that I just opened the assistant to create the Sentinel service. But because the service requires a workspace, well, first we just experience the user interface to create the log workspace. Once that I can see it, I can select it, and then I can click on Add. And then we can see a notification of adding Microsoft Sentinel to your workspace. But as this example and as many others, Sentinel will not display no record until we just create the first data connection. So now we can see the user interface of the Sentinel. And as you can see, there is nothing extra that I need to care, or that I am responsible for. There is no servers, there is no operating system, there is no nothing. Now we can just start using it. But well, we need to start designing and defining which data connectors do we need. For Sentinel permissions and roles, we can use the Azure role-based access control to create and to assign roles in our security operations team. Azure role-based access control led us to grant appropriate access to Sentinel. The different roles will give us a specific control over what users of Azure Sentinel or Microsoft Sentinel can access and do. And we can use Sentinel specific roles with the role delegation. There are 3 dedicated built-in Microsoft Sentinel roles. One of them is the reader. This role can review the data, the incident workbooks, and other Sentinel resources. The second one is a responder. And this role has all the permissions of the reader role, plus it can manage incidents by assigning or dismissing them. And the number 3 is a contributor. This role has all the permissions of the reader and responder roles, but also it can create and edit workbooks, analytic rules, and other Sentinel resources. To deploy Sentinel on our tenant, we need contributor permissions for the subscription where the Sentinel workspace is deployed. For Azure Log Analytic roles and Azure roles, we can use built-in role-based access control roles. Azure roles will grant access across all of our Azure resources, and they will include the Log Analytic workspaces and Azure Sentinel resource permissions on it. We can use global roles. The global roles are not limited to a specific service, like an owner and contributor and a reader. Those kind of global roles doesn't care about the type of resource. An owner is an owner independently on the type of resource that we are managing. So it will have full permissions on that resource. A contributor has the similar permission access of an owner. He can perform any operation, but the only difference is that the contributor is limited to not to perform a level of access for a user, or doesn't have the privilege to delegate permissions or modify permissions to others. That is something that an owner can do. But a contributor can do whatever he can at that resource level, but not to modify the access level for a user, like removing a role or adding a role or editing a role. And there is the other global role that it doesn't care about the type of resource, a reader. A user with this permission is able to have read permissions on every resource, but with read permissions on, of course. There are log analytics roles that can help us to grant access across all of our log analytics workspace, including the one that we're using for the Sentinel, for this SIM. Log Analytics contributor, it's a Log Analytics a specific role example, and Log Analytics reader. But because that is a resource specific log, a user with that can access to the Log Analytics to generate some queries and results. However, because your lack of permission for Sentinel, you cannot go to Sentinel service and then configuring something or setting up a rule or something like that from there if you don't have permission to make a change on. Sentinel environment settings are managed in two areas, in Sentinel and in the Log Analytic workspace, where the Azure Sentinel resides or where the Microsoft Sentinel resides. In Sentinel, the left navigation has an option for settings, and the settings will include tabs for pricing, settings, and workspace settings. The settings changes over time based on the current and in preview feature. Most Sentinel environment settings are managed in the Log Analytics workspace, and other areas within the Sentinel portal will transfer you to the Log Analytics portal. One example of this is or are specific data connector configurations that will be performed in the Log Analytics workspace. And for example, within those settings, we can modify the data retention in days to configure the log retention. Sentinel environment settings are managed in two areas, one in Microsoft Sentinel and in the Log Analytics workspace where the Sentinel resides. So in Microsoft Sentinel, the left navigation has an option for settings. The settings will include the tabs for pricing, settings, and workspace settings. The settings changes over time. Other areas within the Sentinel portal will transfer us to the Log Analytics workspace. An example can be in a specific data connector configuration that are performed in the Log Analytics workspace. There are three primary log types in Sentinel. We can find out an analytic log, a basic log, and an archive log. Data in each table in a Log Analytic workspace is retained for a specified period of time, after which it is either removed or archived with a reduced retention fee. We can set the retention time to balance our requirement for having data available with reducing our cost for data retention. And to access to archive data, we must first retrieve some data from it in an analytic log table using one of the following methods by using a restoring or a search job. For the analytical logs, by default, all tables in a workspace area and it's are of a type of analytic logs, which are available to all features of a Log Analytic workspace and any other services that use the workspace. While a basic log, we can configure certain tables as basic logs to reduce the cost of storing the high volume verbose logs that we use for debugging, for troubleshooting, for auditing, but not for analytics and alerts. So tables configured for basic logs will have a lower ingestion cost in exchange for reduced features. So basic logs are only retained for 8 days. And for archive logs, archiving led us to keep older and less used data in our workspace at a reduced cost, of course. And each workspace has a default retention policy that it's applied to all tables. We can set a different retention policy on individual tables. During the interactive retention period, the data is available for monitoring, for troubleshooting, and for analytics. When we no longer use the logs, but we still need to keep the data for compliance or occasional investigation, we can archive the logs to save the cost. And we can access archive data by running a search job or restoring the archive logs. Lesson 3 is for querying how we can query logs in Sentinel. We have 2 topics into this lesson. Use the logs page to view tables in Sentinel and query the most used tables using Microsoft Sentinel. Sentinel collects log data that is stored in the form of tables. The logs page in Sentinel will provide a user interface to build and view query results using custom query language, or KQL. So KQL is the query language used to perform the data analysis, to create analytics, to create workbooks, and to perform hunting in Azure Sentinel or Microsoft Sentinel. In Sentinel, the logs page provides access to the query window. The query window allows us to run queries, to save queries, to run save queries, to create new other rules, and export it. And the left side provides a list of tables and related table fields. To run a query, we need to enter the query text, and we can press the run button. The query results will appear in the bottom section of the form. Here we can find out all the time the schema with a list of the tables. Now, the number of tables will depend on the number of data connectors that we have. As we are connecting data connectors from the list to the workspace, the more tables that are being added to the schema. If we don't have no data connectors, then we will have just a default schema with some table names included, but not the same amount of tables like if we have a couple of data connectors already, for example. Then the schema is all the time there in a vertical menu. Then we have an area that is, let's say, sharing the upper part of the middle of the visualization dashboard. That is for the querying engine or the querying editor, where we can just start writing. The querying editor is context sensitive. As soon as we are writing something, like a table name, a function, an operator, as soon as we are writing something the right way, it is trying to guess. And we can use tab to complete whatever we are writing, for example, to build a query. It's more intuitive to use it. And the section that goes from the middle of the dashboard and the other half is for the error results from the queries. And this is where, by using the render operators, we can play between the default format will be all the time the table. But sometimes some results are going to be more friendly to identify something specific and switch it to a different render output format, for example. Understanding the Sentinel tables, we can see examples of different tables on it. For example, a security alert table, what we're going to find into this table when we have data connectors. It will contain alerts generated from Sentinel analytical rules. Also, it could include alerts created directly from a Sentinel data connector. Another table is the security incident. Here, alerts can generate incidents, and incidents are related to alerts. There is another table called the Threat Intelligence Indicator that contains user-created or data connectors ingested indicators, such as file hashes, IP addresses, domains. There is another table for watch lists. The Microsoft Sentinel watch list will contain imported data, Some other common tables are the Azure Activity that will include entries from the Azure Activity log, Azure Diagnostics that will store resource logs for services that use the Azure Diagnostics mode, audit logs to uh, store audit log for Azure Active Directory, common security log for syslog messages using the common event format or the CEF, Office Activity for audit logs for Office 365 tenants, Exchange, SharePoint, and Teams, security event table for security events collected from Windows devices, signing logs for Azure Active Directory signing logs, syslog for syslog events on Linux computers using the log analytics agent, event table for sysmon events collected from a Windows host, and Windows Firewall for Windows Firewall events. Table from Microsoft 365 Defender, a, a device event table. This table will contain information about various event types from devices. Um, device file events for file creation, modification, and other file system events. Device image load events for DLL loading events. Device info that include their operating system version, active users, and computer name. Device logon events for user logons and other authentication events. Device network events for network connections and related events. Device network info that will include network adapters, IP, MAC addresses, and connected networks or domains. Device process events for process creation and related events, and device registry events, creation and modification of registry entries. Okay, Module 5 is including a lab number 1, to configure our Sentinel environment. Okay, this is an exercise that we can run for the presentation because it's included as part of the today's lectures, for example, and today's exercise. So if you wanted to follow me, please feel free to start loading your lab. Let me just resume my lab session. Well, this has been loading. Well, it is for the module number 5. So we can take a look at the image to find out what is the diagram for this. The expectation is, well, across 3 different tasks, we're going to initialize the Microsoft Sentinel workspace. Sentinel will be created on top of a log analytics workspace resource. At task number 2, we're going to use it to create a watch list that it is like creating a list of to import information or data. In this case, a list of hosts, for example. When we are running a command or correlating some information, sometimes we need to include information from the external that we will not find into all of the existing tables. So what if I wanted to run a query and correlate information for a list of hosts and that are so specific? Like, for example, we can see a host 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. We can replace those host names with a real host names of virtual machine or server, like a server 1234 or something like that, or an ADDS number 1, an Active Directory domain service, an ADFS2, and so on, or an application proxy 3, web service 2, web service 5, and so on. So we have the possibility to use a watch list to import this information and then correlate it with other tables, so we can create union of tables on it, and then we can generate a result, for example. In task 3, we're going to create a threat indicator, a threat intelligence indicator in Sentinel, basically. Okay, so the steps. Oh, well, let's start in reading out the context. You are a security operations analyst working at a company that is implementing Microsoft Sentinel, and you are responsible for setting up the Sentinel environment to meet the company requirements to minimize the cost, to meet compliance regulations, and to provide the most manageable environment for our security team to perform the daily job. Responsibilities. Task number 1, we need to initialize the Sentinel workspace. In this task, we will create a Sentinel workspace. Well, instruction says that we need to be located into the Wing 1 computer. In the resources tab, we can see how many computers we have. There is a Wing 1, a Wing 2, a Wing server, Link 1, and Link 2. 3 computers with Windows or Windows Server, and 2 with Linux, for example. So this is important. So we need to be located on Wing 1, which is the case. You can read the name of the computer here in this menu on the middle of the virtual or lab virtual machine view. So we're located in the right one. So in the case that is block or something like that, I can unlock it with this local admin and this password, but it's already, let's say, unlocked. We need to open the Edge browser. We need to sign into the Azure portal. I'm already into the Azure portal with the credentials provided in my resources tab. And just enter the password. And in the search bar, we need to look for Sentinel. And click on the name of the service. I can see how. Welcome to Azure says. Oh, I don't have the subscription yet, but well, I will cheat on this lab. I will use these other credentials because I just within this tenant. This is another tip that I can provide to you. When you need to copy something for your real machine, for your physical one, you can use the clipboard text to paste it there and then click on OK, and that will send the information from your computer to the VM. I will do the same operation. I just made a mistake for the password here, because I did not activate the Azure password in that account. So that's why when I just clicking on the Sentinel service, that tenant is not the identifying an active subscription on. So that's why I don't see it. But well, I just sign in with a different account, the one that I have an Azure subscription active, and then I can just click on the Sentinel. I will see my 2 Sentinels that I just used the second a couple of minutes ago with the same subscription using my computer. Just sign in using the same account. Now I can see that I have 2 Sentinel, but I will create number 3 following the instructions. So we need to click here to create button. Then select the log workspace that you created earlier. For example, the unique name defender, and select add. The activation could take a few minutes. Okay, so what I can do is to use the existing one. Select the log workspace you created earlier. If you don't see a log workspace, please refer to module 3, exercise 1, a previous task, for example. That's not my case, but well, I already have a Sentinel. Navigate around the newly created Sentinel workspace. So well, let me return Sentinel 2. No data connection here. That's why I don't have no event, no alert, no incident. Become familiar with the user interface options. Task number 2 is to create and import the watch list. In this task, we will create a watch list in Sentinel. So in the search box of at the bottom of the Windows 10 screen, I need to Enter Notepad to open the Notepad application locally into that VM1 virtual machine or Win1, sorry, virtual machine. Type host name, then enter different lines. What I can do is just click here to automatically paste this. Or from row number 2, so you should need to hit on the enter to move on to that row number 2, clicking here on the T, and make sure that the host 1 and up to 5 are pasted. From the menu, we can click on File, and then on Save As, and then I need to name the file as a high value with a .csv format, comma separated value. The file can be saved in the Documents folder. Okay. Close the Notepad. In the Sentinel, select the watch list. So I can scroll down. Under the configuration area, we will find out the option number 3, the watch list. Under the configuration, select add a new on the top. So we can read what is a watch list. Sentinel watch list enables the collection of data from external data sources for correlation against the events in our Microsoft Sentinel environment. So once created, we can leverage watch lists in our search, detection rules, threat hunting, workbooks, and response playbook. And how does it work? You can create a new by clicking on that new and following the steps in the new watchlist wizard or assistant, and we will receive a notification in the notification area within the Azure portal that our watchlist was created. Watchlists are stored within our Sentinel workspace as name value pairs and are cached for optimal query performance and low latency. So the step says that selecting the watch list, clicking on add new. Then in the watch list wizard, we need to enter the following: name, high value host, description, high value host but with spaces, and alias, no spaces. Next for source, browse for files, and I need to look for the documents and the recently created high value.csv. Common separated value format. And then I need to click on next to review. In the search key field, sorry, I'm just missing a step. Select the host name. Then select on review and create. And then finally, click to create. The screen returns to the watch list page. And then we need to select the high value host watch list. And on the right pane, we can click on view in logs. This redirects us to the log workspace editor, and we can see, okay, the underscore get watch list like a function to call a high value host. But well, we can see a notification there that is important, something to pay attention. It could take up to 10 minutes for the watch list to appear. So please continue with the following task and run this command on the next lab. So that's why we just received a no result found. The expectation will be to see the host 1 and up to 5 in the result. And now we can use the underscore get watch list, in parentheses, single quote, high value host in our own KQL statements to access the list. So the column to reference will be the host name. We can close the logs by selecting the X in the top right and then select on OK to discard the changes. Task number 3, and well, not yet the last one. In this task, we will create an indicator in Sentinel. So we can select the threat intelligence by scrolling up from threat management section. We can click on threat intelligence. In the threat management area, we can select on add new from the command bar, and we need to review the different indicator type available in the types dropdown, and we can select A domain name. Review the different available in the types drop down, and we select the domain dash name. Enter your initials into the domain box. Okay. And an example would be fmg.com. Well, in this case, for the thread types, write down malicious activities. Malicious dash activity. And okay. For the name, enter the same values used to the domain. Set the value from field to today's date. Value in front and select on apply. Select the logs option under the general area. You might want to disable the always show queries option. Says you might want to disable the always show queries option and close the query window to run the KQL statement. Another notification here that, or another something important to remember, that after creating it, it could take up to 5 minutes for the indicator to appear. Okay. Select the option under the general area. To open the query editor, we might want to disable the always show the queries. And this is the important. Run the following KQL statement. Click here on the T to paste threat intelligence indicator. Because the query editor is context sensitive. And well, the expectation, because of the node, could take up to 5 minutes for the indicator to up. Scroll the results to the right to see the domain name, the column, and we can also run a following to project. Using the project operator, we are just only displaying that column, the domain name. From the other possible ones, it's only one to display. But well, we are not going to see any result yet until some time refreshes this option, but the second command will look like this. And the final task is for setting up the log retention into our Sentinel. So in this task, you will change the retention period of the security event table. So in Sentinel, we need to locate the configuration area, and we need to go for the settings, the last option. Click on OK to discard the changes. Select the workspace settings. In Log Analytics workspace, select the tables with preview between parentheses. Search and select the table security event. Security event is here. And then select the ellipsis bottom. That I think that is at the right, so we need to scroll horizontally. And then we're going to select manage the table. And we're going to set 180 days for total retention, or 6 months, and then clicking on save. And well, congratulations, you have completed the lab. You have successfully completed this exercise, so you need to click on next to advance to the next one. Okay, so that's good news, guys. The next is for the module 6, but module 6 includes a lab 1, an exercise 1, and an exercise 2 and 3. But you are going to work with that lab exercise within the lab and Q&A time in approximately an hour and a half after the 30-minute break and connected to the session of lab Q&A. Okay, that's where you initially configure the Sentinel, configure log retention, importing a watch list, and a threat indicator, for example. Okay, now it's time for switching to another module, the number 6, if I'm right. Give me a second to open it and set it up to presentation mode. Okay, the module 6 is for connecting logs to Microsoft Sentinel. First lesson is we're going to connect data to Microsoft Sentinel using the data connectors. Three main lessons here. Explain the use of data connectors in Sentinel, describe the Microsoft Sentinel data connector providers, and explain the common event format and syslog connector differences in Microsoft Sentinel. Now, no log workspace or no Sentinel service will have connections by default. And we are limited to the available connectors on the data connectors list. So we can see, for example, that 120 connectors reported for the image. This number can be slightly different than the real one because connectors eventually are updated to new ones, for example. So if I go configuration and data connectors, I may see a different number or maybe just still into the 120 if it is an updated image, for example. 124 actually, 4 more than the image. And we can scroll down to see all of the available connectors. And we can see that as we are moving on or scrolling down, we can find out that there are multiple connectors from third-party security solutions and some others internal connectors from the same Azure environment. The main difference between those two types, let's say internal or external, is that the internal doesn't require like a lot of prerequisites or configuration because everything happens within the same Azure environment. So the only thing that I need is permissions to connect one service to another and starting ingesting some information. We can take the example of, I don't know, the Azure Activity Connector. It's a subscription log that provides insights into subscription level events that occur in Azure, including events from Azure Resource Manager, operational data, service held events, right operations taken on the resources in your subscription, and the status. So I can open connector page to see the requirements. And well, the requirement will be more like, okay, you need to have a workspace with read and write permissions on. And then there is a need of a policy with an owner and role assigned for each policy assignment. But with this account, this is the global admin and the owner for the subscription. Subscription or a role on the relevant permissions on it. So I just comply with everything. But well, there is another requirement here. Now I need to disconnect our subscription from a legacy method and connect our subscription through diagnostic settings new pipeline. And I need to launch the Azure policy assignment wizard and follow these steps to apply a policy on a remediation tab and mark the create remediation task checkbox. Okay, so this will require a little bit more steps. So maybe I can just return and select the Azure Active Directory logs. That here the instructions are going to be more pretty straightforward, like clicking on the options and checkboxes to specify what are the type of logs that I need. All of the checks are green. That means that I have everything that I need. To connect it, I would like to connect to sign-in logs, audit logs, the ones that are not in preview. The other ones, I don't care so far. So just clicking on apply the changes and successfully apply the changes on. So I will see eventually that this type of events that I'm just generated at this point and in the future will be stored as copies into the log workspace that Sentinel is using. So when I'm just querying the Sentinel to the table names that are storing this information, I will see events. And actually, I just did that into the other workspace, the Sentinel-1, for example. So from yesterday and today, we can see that there is multiple events that are now being collected by the Sentinel-1. So when I take a look at the overview of this workspace, we can see into its graphics a series of events or that is representing information. So for example, here, if I taking a look at the overview, then I will see some graphics that I have 81 events so far. 48 of them are representing operations, 24 usage, some other AS Azure Active Directory non-interactive sign-ins or something like that. So when I'm clicking on one of those numbers, then I will be redirected to the details on that query to find out where all these events are coming from, querying which table, for example, and so on. So, well, this is taking too much to respond this loading. I don't know if it is my computer or the internet connection. Should import the query. Yeah, I can see it. And these are the events that I'm just the 48 as the record count here. But well, the visualization on the dashboard is using a different format. It's taking the raw data on the table and using a different render format into column, for example, and that was the graphic that I was looking for example, at the beginning on it. But this is the original query. And with the original output format into a table format. Some data connector providers. The Microsoft 365 Defender and related data connectors will provide alerts and data that has already been normalized and used in the Microsoft 365 Defender portal. The 365 Defender products will include connectors for the Microsoft Defender for Endpoint, Defender for Identity, Defender for Office 365, Defender for Cloud Apps. So the connectors for Microsoft and Azure related services will include, but are not limited to, Azure Active Directory, audit logs, and sign-in logs, Azure Activity, Azure AD Identity Protection, Azure Distributed Denial of Service Protection, Defender for IoT, Information Protection, Azure Firewall, Security Center Alerts or Defender for Cloud Alerts, Web Application Firewall, Cloud Application Security, Domain Name Server, Office 365, Windows Firewall, Security Events, and many others. There are vendor connectors also. Sentinel provides an ever-growing list of vendor-specific data connectors. And these connectors primarily use the common event format and syslog connectors. These are the type of connectors that a Linux-based operating system uses. There are custom connectors using the Log Analytics API. We can use the Log Analytics Data Collector API to send log data to the Azure Sentinel Log Analytics workspace. There are also Logstash plugin. This plugin uses the Sentinel output plugin for the Logstash data collection engine, and we can send any log that we want through the Logstash directly to our log analytic workspace in Sentinel. So the logs are written to a custom table that we define using the output plugin. CEF, or common event format, and syslog connector. If there is no vendor provided connector, this is would be more like a generic connector that we can use. The generic common event format, or syslog connector. Syslog is an event logging protocol that is common to Linux. So applications will send the messages that may be stored on the local machine or delivered to a syslog collector. So common event format is an industry standard format on top of syslog messages that are used by many security vendors to allow the event interoperability among different platforms. The data connectors page will show the connectors that are connected. So the amount of Windows and Linux hosts connected with the Log Analytics agent is available in the Log Analytics workspace user interface. So to see our connected host, we can follow the steps to select the settings, go into workspace settings. In the log settings, Log Analytics settings area, we will select the agent management. And there are two tabs to view, one for Windows and another for Linux. And we can see a number of connected already. Lesson 2 is for connecting Microsoft services to Microsoft Sentinel. We have two lessons or topics here. Connect Microsoft services connectors and explain how connectors auto-create incidents in Sentinel. A plan for a Microsoft service connector, for example, we need to be in compliance with the requirements. Like in my case, to have a tenant with global administrator permissions, owner or contributor permissions to the subscription, and maybe some other prerequisites depending on the data connector, for example. Then we need to go for a configuration, selecting the logs that I would like, the signing log, for example, from the previous connector, and then the possibility to create incidents from there. But no incident will be created automatically. And let me show you. By returning to the Sentinel, and by going back a little bit, I will take a look at the connector that I previously selected. For example, here, if I'm taking a look at the data connectors, I will check again the data connector that I just used as my example, the Azure Active Directory. We can see a change in the color here with a green one for the ones that are connected and the others that are not. I can open the connectors page. And then if we take a look at the related content, we can see that there is 8 built-in template workbooks that, if you remember, a workbook is just a dashboard that we can create from a template, 2 template queries for going for the investigation, and this connector is including up to 99 analytic rule templates from the multiple type of threads or incidents associated with this connector, with the Azure Active Directory, the service that I'm using to create users and to sign in and sign out users. We can import from this template alerts from this 99 associated with this connector, with this data connector, basically. So if I'm clicking on this 99 analytic role templates, we can eventually see all the possible rules from the 99 that I can use to create. And if you remember the concept of the cyber kill chain for the MITRE ATT&CK matrix enterprise, you remember that there is multiple tactics and multiple techniques per tactic. So that means that these analytic rule templates that I can take from these built-ins are associated with different type of tactics on it. So when I just if I'm interested into one or multiple, this one, for example, for the Azure Active Directory source, I can just click here I would like to create this alert rule to turn on the rule and to continuously monitor this particular type of threat. If I'm just importing the rule and creating it, and if it is turned on, these conditions will be continuously evaluated. And well, we can read the name of the rule and the description. An admin promotion after role management application permission grant. So this rule looks for a service principal being granted the Microsoft Graph role management that rewrite that directory application permission before being used to add an Azure AD object or user account to an admin director role. Tactics and techniques associated, persistent, with the account manipulation, the valid accounts, another for privilege escalation, and another valid account for it. There is a pre-configured severity. The status for this rule will be enabled. The rule logic is basically its query. So the query is there. I don't need to create it. I don't need to modify it. It's querying the audit logs and it's looking for something as this security pattern. Some incident settings. If I would like to include an automated response and importing or creating my own playbook with a logic app, review and create. So at the end, I can just click I would like to create this into my rules. And once that I just imported, I can just return to my Sentinel and I can locate into my left vertical menu the analytics section under configuration. Then into the analytics, my new analytic rule will be added as a permanent rule into the Sentinel workspace. And I will see a status for that. So far, every Sentinel will have a default analytic rule turned on, which is the fusion. Now, if we do have the permissions, we can make a decision to disable this alert. But well, we can read the description also to see how it works. Sentinel uses this fusion rule, which is a correlation engine based on scalable machine learning algorithms to automatically detect a multi-stage attack by identifying combinations of anomalous behaviors and suspicious activities that are observed at various stages of the kill chain. On the basis of these discoveries, Sentinel generates incidents that will otherwise be very difficult to catch. So by design, these incidents are low volume, high fidelity, high severity, which is why this detection is turned on by default. And well, we can read some more details on. To enable this detection, we recommend to configure the following data connectors for better results. Out of the box, Azure Active Directory Identity Protection, Defender for IoT, 365 Defender, and so on. Along with this one, I can start importing the other rules that comes with the connectors on it. But of course, if there's no connectors, no data connections initially, then I don't need those rules because nothing will be queried if we don't have the data types already collected from the workspace. But as soon as I'm connecting data, I can take a look at the built-in analytic rule templates, and I can start importing ones that I have the data connection from that connector. For example, now I can start activating the alerts from the attacks that I just would like to get a notification and receive it and trigger an alert automatically when something like that happens. This is an example of a view of a data connector from the Microsoft Office 365 connector to display the activity log that this connector provides as insights. Its prerequisites are to have permissions into the workspace and to have global administrator or security administrator tenant permissions or level of role. This Office 365 connector is limited to 3 services: the Exchange service, the SharePoint service, and the Teams service, for storing the activity logs from those services. Because Office 365 is including other services on it, but it's not going to monitor each of the single services, but the 3 core, Exchange, SharePoint, and Teams, will be included. The Azure Active Directory connector already showed you how to connect, actually, to gain insights into the Azure Active Directory. Basically the same description that we just saw from there. Now, I just remember that the analytic rule templates are 99 or 90 something instead of the 53. So big number of updated analytic rules. So that means that dynamically the connector is being updated automatically with more analytic rules that we can take, and we can make a decision to import, for example. The identity protection connector, with identity protection, we can detect risk on every sign-in event, and the risks are going to be set on 3 different categories: low risk, medium, and high, or no risk at all. But when there is a category, then there will be from the 3. And we can use this policy for identity protection to deny a sign-in event if a level of risk pattern is detected into the event. And if there is a level of risk detected, that risk detection goes to a log. And if I would like to see that log into Sentinel, then I can use the data connector to store that information into the workspace from Sentinel. There are other Azure-related connectors, like the Azure Activity one, Azure Distributed Denial of Service Protection. Now, how this Distributed Denial of Service Protection works? This operates, these connectors are going to be integrated with other Azure services. For example, the Azure Activity is associated with the Azure Monitor service. What's the Azure Monitor? Azure Monitor is a built-in monitoring service that is free to use and that is always turned on into our subscription, that records all of the activity logs associated with my subscription and my tenant. If I wanted to investigate, for example, who, when, and what happens, I can use the Azure Monitor with these Azure Activity Logs, for example. So this is another internal connector. The DDoS protection, or Distributed Denial of Service, this is associated with Azure Virtual Network, or VNet, or exposed at the public IP services, basically. Because this Distributed Denial of Service is a common attack that tries to overflow a service to make it not available. A service that can be reachable from the internet. So let's say that I have, let's say, a virtual machine. that I just call the virtual machine number one. And this virtual machine has a public IP address. Through this public IP address, I can access from the external. Let's say that this is a user, and that this user with its own device can make a request to the public IP. And now the virtual machine is using its public IP address and it's exposing the right port, like the HTTP or HTTPS. User can make a request and find out the service and receive a response back. This will be a regular interaction into a client and server. And because I previously configured to be a public service. Now, imagine that this is not like a real user making a request, but is an orchestrated botnet attack. When an attacker is gaining access to other devices and is orchestrating a volumetric attack. Multiple requests from different locations. That's why the first D is for distributed. Distributed that are not from the same source. If it is not from the same source, it's more difficult to detect as a pattern from an attack, for example. So the first D for the distributed and the next for the denial of service. That at the end, the multiple requests orchestrated at the same time to the same IP address will make that the ports or the network response from the public IP address for this service goes overflowed, and it will take the service down at the network level. And if at that point I have real requests from real clients, the request or the service is not responding or not able to filter and detect that there is which one is a real request and from the others one that are just making requests on this one. So this option, we can turn it on at the level of our VNet and at the level of the public IP address that will serve as some kind of a shield or a filtering option that can redirect these requests to another destination that Azure has the global scale of the multiple data centers on. The DDoS will detect this attack as a pattern, and it will filter out and resend that traffic to a different place, not to the destination public IP address. So when we have a real request, it is going to find the service because the other ones are not actually finally reaching to the public IP address. An Azure firewall is considered a firewall as a service. That means that there is no servers, no operating systems that we're responsible for. We just create a firewall as a service, as a single resource, and this firewall can act as a firewall, as a built-in firewall that is not into a dependency of a virtual machine or operating system. The Azure firewall is highly available, it's scalable, and it provides multiple layer protection taking the reference of the OSI model. We can create hub and spoke network topologies. For example, we can take a look here at an Azure firewall diagram or reference architecture by looking at the images. And we can see what can we do, for example, this image. We can use a firewall as a central point for managing or filtering the traffic, controlling the traffic, let's say. The central VNet is acting as a hub where all the traffic goes in and eventually goes out. And the other VNets are considered as spoke VNets. I can see that there is a connection to the on-premise also. So it can also manage the traffic that comes to and from the on-premise one and the traffic to the external, to the internet. for example. The firewall can also perform network address translation. So that means that the spokes that are connected with peering, that means that there is a logical connection with the VNet spoke 1 and 2 to the central VNet without being exposed to the public or with a public IP address to computers. The firewall will include a couple of public IP addresses. With network address translation, computers from a spoke can navigate to the internet or can be resolved from the external, but by using the public IP addresses and the network address translation, source and destination network address translation, uh, to not overexposing the computers to public IP addresses, and that request passes through the firewall. And if it is detecting some potential risk, it can make a decision to deny the traffic if there is no particular rules accepting or allowing the traffic, for example. And we just create one simple object into our Azure subscription, and that is the firewall. It is highly available, so that means that there is more than one instance backing up that service, but I don't have the responsibility of those instances, no operating systems to control, nothing to patch, nothing to update. It comes with a high availability and with a service level agreement. I guarantee that the service will be up and running and scalable in the case that I need to adapt to peak on demands when I have multiple requests, for example, from the firewall. So there is a connector that also helped me to ingest all these logs and records for all of the traffic that goes in and out. And also I can use the SIEM for the correlation of these logs that come from one or multiple firewalls. Azure Key Vault is another related connector. A Key Vault is like a cloud storage repository to securely storing 3 types of items. Secrets is one of them. An example of a secret could be a connection string for a database. Some plain text value that I should keep as a secret because in the case that that value is compromised, the authentication to that service will be compromised. So some sort of a password or a secret word or a connection string. Another item that I can protect in the key vault at the same time as secret are cryptographic keys. And the number 3 is certificate files for authenticating applications securely, for example. SSL and TLS, for example. So this is the key vault on it, because a key vault is for keeping up critical information or storing critical information and avoiding overexposing. The key vault is including a multi-layers of protection, including a data layer and a management layer. Usually I can include these key vaults with applications. So when there is a need for an application to communicate to another or to a system, the developers can refer or can make references to secret IDs or to certificate files or cryptographic keys to perform the automatic encryption and decryption process, or the authentication by pulling secrets from vaults securely by using service principals, for example, that are identities for applications. Other forms of connectors that we can use is this Azure SQL databases. This is a relational database that operates into the platform as a service model, or a database as a service, a PaaS service. That means that we just create a couple of resources, the logical server and the database, but there is no need to keep and to manage or be fully responsible for a SQL Server instance that involves using an operating system based on Linux or based on Windows, and the avoiding single point of failures and the storage and the VNet and the public IP, the private IP addressing, and so on. The SQL Server instance version and addition, maintenance, patching, and everything. We don't care about all that stuff. We just create the Azure SQL database. It is using a SQL Server instance, the more recent one. Patching, updating the operating system is not our responsibility. And we can create it in another 2 minutes. And we can start migrating databases to that service or importing or creating new ones, for example. So there is a Sentinel data connector from this because there is certain security features that we can turn on with advanced threat detection in SQL that also can help us to perform database auditing, database threat detection, and so on. That we can ingest all that information in this log with this data connector to Sentinel, and we can consolidate that monitoring from the Sentinel service. When there is a threat associated to relational database as the target, the Sentinel can detect that, and if we have the proper alerts, it can start triggering alerts and notifying somebody, or we can react automatically by importing into that connector a reaction from those alerts with an automation workflow, like we call it in a logic app from a playbook. And finally, the Web Application Firewall Connector, or the WAF, is a complementary security feature that we can find it in 3 type of resources. The WAF can be founded into an application gateway, which is an Azure resource that acts as a layer 7 load balancing solution, regional load balancer. We can find an optional, we can turn on a web application firewall on this service that is a layer 7 load balancer. The other item that we can turn on or use a WAF is into an Azure front door. Front door is another load balancing solution, layer 7, but the difference that this is a global load balancer. That means that it can load balancer resources across different regions at the same time, while the app gateway is limited to a single region. So with the front door, we can expand better high availability, because if I have 2 instances of a service in a region A and V, when the region A goes down, the app gateway and all these services go down and there's no service. But the front door, by being not limited to a single region, just to the regions as these instances into its backend pull list are operating, if the region I goes down, if I have a secondary region service, the front door will detect that and will redirect the traffic to the other instance that is into another region or the other service. So I will have better availability by using a front door, the global load balancer, instead of the regional. And WAF also can be turned on at the Content Delivery Network, CDN, that we can use it as a caching solution, caching content from a origin that could be, for example, on a storage account. For content distribution, this using multiple points of presence that Microsoft has across the different locations. And by using this caching mechanism, when somebody's making a request, instead of going for the origin that is into a storage account into a single region, if the user is located into a completely different country, internally, the CDN will cache with high-speed network from the origin to the closer point of presence that is closer to the end user making the request. And the end user making the request is going to get the file or the content from its closer point of presence. That would be with better performance detected by the end user or by the client at the end, for example. Then going to the original source, that could be a lot of latency, because there could be thousands of miles of distance on from completely separate regions. So all this information about the WAF, The WAF will include a series of built-in rules based onto the OWASP, an open source rules 3.1 or something like that. So there is a series of rules that are being evaluated. Findings for these results, when there is a threat from these baseline rules, will be stored into Sentinel, or into this connector is going to store these logs. So if there is something as a security threat detected, it will be detected by the Sentinel. If we have alerts and rules to automate the reaction on it, we can just receive notifications or perform automated actions if required, as required. Okay, we have the part of the labs. Lab number 1, connecting logs to Sentinel from this module number 6. But there is multiple exercises on it. First one is to connect data to Sentinel using data connectors. Then we need to connect Windows devices to Microsoft Sentinel using data connectors. Then we need to connect Linux hosts to Microsoft Sentinel using data connectors, and we need to collect threat intelligence to Microsoft Sentinel using data connectors. Now, we still have 90 minutes of time on it. So what we can do is to continue with the labs exercises. I can see that there is a couple of questions in the Q&A. Also, I can answer to some of the questions. Where can I view the current log retention period set in the Sentinel? Okay, you can go for the settings into the left vertical menu, and then you will find out log retention settings. And from there, you can select those options, and you can select your the event data types that you would like to modify. Question: is it possible to directly search in SQL tables connected via Azure SQL Server's connector to generate alerts? Usually, it is possible, but there is a process to configure an integration from your SQL Server instances into Azure virtual machines or computers outside of Azure, like your on-premise, to turn on the advanced data security for databases that usually involves downloading and installing an agent into those instances. So with the agent communicating with the data connector, you can start storing the information like if you have your databases into Azure SQL database, but it is possible. Other question is, can external sources, for example, from another tenant, be connected to a central Sentinel, and how? Remember that Sentinel is using log analytic workspace. Okay? So if you remember, how can we connect data to our Sentinel? Through the data connectors. Okay? So usually what we can connect from the external, from other clouds or from the on-premise, are information about computers, physical computers or virtual machines. So in this case, and how that log collection works by the agent distribution. If you remember, just working with the log workspace, let me use the other tab to not lose the Sentinel. I can take the example of any of the workspaces that I have. What data can we collect into a workspace? Azure virtual machines, Windows and Linux agent management, storage account logs, and System Center Operations Manager. So if one of the options that I would like to collect from an external environment different than my subscription matches one of these data sources, that means that I can perform that connection. So if I'm interested into a physical computer or into an Azure virtual machine, but from another tenant, then you can just click on this one, and then you can say, okay, I want to connect this virtual machine one, but to a separate workspace. What you can do is to go for the log workspace, you can go for the agent management, and you can start, okay, I would like to connect that Linux or Windows physical or virtual machine, and I will download the corresponding agent. This is the one for Windows, and this is the one for Linux. And with the Linux, the commands and instructions to follow. And then this is a workspace ID that it doesn't matter where these computers are located. If they have internet access with an outbound port of 445, I don't remember the requirement, but you can just read the requirements on it. The workspace ID is unique. So the agent can look for that workspace, and if there is the corresponding outbound firewall rules open from that local environment or that third party or other cloud environment, and is using the one of the two right keys, the primary or secondary, that computer located outside Azure or located outside of my tenant can locate the workspace, and with this option will authenticate to that workspace. It's like a telling that I'm a trusted user, for example, or a trusted source, and eventually we'll start ingesting those logs. And now, because, well, a common case for that will be that I'm providing security analyst services to other organizations. If I'm a security specialist or something like that, I would like to monitor the information. One option will be that I should have access to that tenant. But another option could be that I'm just creating a sentinel in a workspace, but that I will start to ingest the logs from the environment from different users, and I'm using the SIEM in Azure to perform the log correlation and the incident detection and so on, for example. Or when our organization are making an acquisition, then eventually I can connect data sources from a different tenant, a different workspace to mine, for example, and that I would like to perform the operations into a different tenant, for example. Or we can also use the Azure Lighthouse. Azure Lighthouse allows you to control different tenants from the security perspective from one consolidated place, for example. So you can perform those manual options of connecting individually data sources to your workspace. But when you are talking about for example, the Azure AD logs to your Sentinel workspace, it is not as straightforward as downloading an agent and configuring. If that's the case, you can use some other method using an event hub, for example. An event hub is an event routing system. Usually, we can configure it in one way. I can use an event hub to send copies of events or to streamline events outside Azure to be able to catch those events into other third-party SIEMs, like Splunk, for example. But I can do something similar to send a copy of those events that Defender for Cloud is collecting, for example. I can put it there into an event hub, and then I can use another subscription or another tenant to catch those logs from the event hub. And I can use my own repository to store those copies of those events into my log workspace. And then I can connect that to Sentinel, and I can just perform the KQL and the security analysis for that. Question is checking if it is possible to please have access to the lecture slides for this module. Many thanks. Well, the bad news for that is that we are not allowed to share the official slides. As you can see, the slides that I'm using has a copyright from Microsoft. You can see here at the bottom. our right resort. And well, we as the Microsoft certified trainers, we are not allowed to share this or to distribute this content. However, you can find out exactly the same content into the Microsoft Learn. Let me show you. If you make a search to the SC-200, go, that will be not in the format of slides, but the same content, you can see it into a URL, basically, but for your convenience. SC200, well, just search into SC200, you will, the first result would be, oh, learn.microsoft.com for this exam. So you can click on it, and you can scroll down a little bit, and you will find out two ways to prepare. Usually the online and free is there, and this is the learning path for Microsoft Learn. So let's say that I'm looking for the modules that I'm covering today. This learning path, configure your Microsoft Sentinel environment, matches with the last module that I just presented a couple of minutes ago. And as you can see, the content is exactly the same. Introduction to Sentinel, what is Sentinel, how Sentinel works, when to use it, and actually you have a knowledge check, for example, at the end, and a summary. How can we create and manage the Sentinel workspace, how we can query, how we can use the watch list, how we can utilize the threat intelligence, and so on. So if you are taking a look, okay, what is Sentinel? If there is images or diagrams, you remember, this is what for the module 5, I think, it is exactly the same image. So it's like if you have the slide, but well, with all this content on. So what is collection, detection, investigation, response, and so on. How Sentinel works. Other screenshot from the connector view from the Azure activity, the type of common data connector for syslog, common event format, log retentions, what are the workbooks, analytic alerts, threat hunting, incident investigations, automation playbooks. Actually, you will find out in some cases, for example, incident investigation is not included with the slides that I'm using. Maybe because you have this topic as a homework, but into this Microsoft Learn content, you will find out all of the content from the entire course in Microsoft Learn. When to use it, knowledge check, and so on. So when you're finishing up with this one, you're actually getting points of experience on it. That is, you can see a bar that is increasing into that, and you can unlock some proof that you already complete this content, basically. And now you can just go back, and if you are done with this, now you can move on to the next one. How you can create and manage a Sentinel workspace, and now you can go for okay. How can you create, oh, for example, manage workspaces across tenants associated with one of the questions on for customers and service provider tenants. How can we use Lighthouse, for example, additional roles and permissions, and so on. How about connecting Defender for endpoint in a different tenant? Connecting Defender for endpoint. I think that there is a Defender for endpoint connector, but you will find it into the Sentinel workspace. I'm thinking into well, let's take a look at the process because I'm not so sure how it is going to work. I'm thinking on something, but I don't want it to just guess. Let's take a look at one of the Sentinels. And then going for the data connectors. And then looking for some of the Defender connectors. Let's say Defender for endpoint, I think, yeah. Let's take a look at the requirements and the process to perform this connection here. We can see here Read and write permissions, license, global administrator, and so on. Connecting Defender will cause your data that is collected by Microsoft Service to be stored and processed in the location that you have configured your Sentinel workspace. Okay, so apparently next steps. To be stored and processed in the locations that you have configured your Microsoft Sentinel workspace. Well, what I'm thinking is that maybe we need to go for Defender and look for a way to use another data source or to configure a data retention to combine it, for example, maybe with a log storage or something like that, or this streaming API, for example, configure direct export of events. So I think that what we can do is this: streaming an API and forward to an storage or forward events to Event Hub. Then from there, we can look on a way on to connect a storage where we already have these logs that Defender is creating. And then I can use a connector into the other tenant to connect to that storage or to create the persistent pipeline with the Event Hub. In order to forward 365 Defender events to Azure Storage and or to an Event Hub. So maybe I can give you a link for looking at more details about this. Stream advanced hunting event to hubs and or Azure Storage. And then we can figure it out. There should be a way on how to connect this Event Hub or storage to another log workspace, for example. So you can search for that, and actually I think that could be a way to do that using the Stream API option, because from the Sentinel, well, I don't see an option to, okay, I just wanted to save a copy or something like that, but from the Defender service there is the streaming API or the connection API. Another question, is it possible to directly search in SQL tables connected via Azure SQL servers connector to generate alerts? Actually, the Azure SQL databases has its own, what was the name for that? Advanced threat detection, for example. That is an extension of Defender for Cloud for SQL. And threats eventually detected when that option is turned on are going to be correlated into Defender for Cloud that is using a log analytic workspace, and Defender for Cloud can generate the alerts from there. But well, not so sure if Sentinel has a connector for SQL that I don't remember, but yeah, there is an Azure SQL database here. Then patching backups monitoring. This connector lets you stream your SQL database audit and diagnostic logs into Sentinel, allowing you to continuously monitor activity in all your instances. Okay, without Sentinel, you can use the advanced threat detection for SQL databases with Defender for Cloud. And with Sentinel, you can use this connector, for example. So you can take a look at, and this will be the data types that will collect for your SQL databases. The difference is that the advanced threat detection from Defender for Cloud, you can also extend it to SQL instance that you have outside Azure, like hosted into a virtual or physical computer or into other cloud environments. And the Azure SQL database being a database as a service, so you're just limited to only use this connector for the Azure SQL database. It's nothing that you have outside, basically. All right, guys. If you have some more questions, you can still post in your questions, but we're a couple of seconds before the end of this session. Remember, we're taking a 30-minute coffee break, and after that 30 minutes, you can join to the other link for the lab and Q&A session, okay? So thank you so much for your time and attention for these 2 hours, and see you in the next lab and Q&A to continue with this Q&A session, and you will start working with your labs for the module 5 and 6. If you already follow me with the 5, then you can just move on with this lab 6 exercises, okay? Thank you guys, and see you in 30 minutes.